Hello again, everyone, and welcome to our first episode of Creepy Crawly Conversations, our podcast series where we explore in-depth insect-related concepts. I'm Jack Elphinstone, and I'm here with my good friend and co-Insect Week organizer, Leanna Fernandez. And today we also have with us the brilliant Dr. Fabio Manfredini, who is an evolutionary ecologist at the University of Aberdeen. Welcome, Fabio, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you, Jack. Thank you, Leanna, and thanks to all our listeners. It's my pleasure to be here with you today to talk about ants.
Thank you again, Fabio. So today, we're going to be discussing a topic that Fabio certainly knows a lot more about than us, and that is fire ants. So just to start off simply, Fabio, what exactly is a fire ant?
So fire ants are ants, of course. So they are insects. This is why they are featured in this weekly podcast. And they belong to the order Hymenoptera, which is an order which includes all ants, bees, and wasps. But if we go more into the details, so fire ants is a specific group of ants within the genus Solenopsis. And they are medium-sized ants. They vary in coloration depending on the species, but they all have in common the fact that they sting. So this is like the key features that make you recognize fire ants pretty immediately. And some other interesting feature is about their ecology. They are from the New World, so they are native from North and South America, but most of them are highly invasive, so they have widespread, they have spread globally, basically, so in most of the continents. So this is a very, very key feature of their ecology.
They definitely sound like quite an interesting insect, but I'm also aware that many other ant species have equally interesting names, such as the silver bullet or the ghost ant. I'm curious, how did these insects end up with the name fire ant?
So this is a very cool question, because it was one of the first questions I had when I started working with fire ants, so I immediately looked it up, because in my native language, in Italian, we are not familiar with fire ants. Of course, they are not in Europe, they're not in Italy, so we don't have these specific terms. And that relates to the key feature that I just mentioned, that they sting. And when they sting, they release this very powerful venom, which is composed of alkaloids, and they produce a pretty immediate reaction into the body of the unlucky organism that is stung. And this reaction basically corresponds to a feeling of burning. So basically it starts very slow, and then this the pain creeps and goes up into the body, in particular if you're stung in your feet or in your ankles, which is pretty most of the case. And so in particular if you're stung by many ants at the same time, you're really feeling like your body is on fire, and I can definitely confirm that that's the case. So this is where fire ant comes from.
That's quite scary.
Yes.
I've often heard that the term superorganism is used to describe fire ants. Could you please explain what this term means for us too?
Yes, so superorganism has been used for over a century now to describe insect societies, or like societies of other animals that are social. Because it's a very effective metaphor to basically explain how this complex society works. So it has been used initially mainly for an analogy in terms of forms and functions. So, for example, ant colonies has been compared to a society of other complex organism, multicellular organism, where you have different body parts, like, for example, different tissue, different organs, and different cells that all work together to the common goals. And similarly, in ant colonies, all individual ants basically work together to achieve the same goal, which is the health and safety of the colony. But more recently, scientists in social biology, they have moved to from a more like a morphological and functional analogy to also like an evolutionary and ecological analysis. So we can basically study ant and other social insect colonies from an evolutionary point of view, trying to understand how, for example, the fitness of the whole colony is achieved through the activity of the single ant. And this equals basically how a complex multicellular organism achieves its own fitness at the global level.
I think that's just fantastic. I mean, to think all of that coordination is shown by an insect, it's very impressive, well, to me at least. Now, in relation to the term superorganism, fire ants may also be categorized as a eusocial insect, but what exactly does it mean for an insect to be eusocial?
So the concept of eusociality is like relies on the fact that there are different nuances in social organisms. So it's not always sharp, like the way how we can define society. So there are more like simple and more complex societies. And eusociality with the particle EU within, at the beginning of the word means like fully or completely social. And this means that there are at least three main features that have to be satisfied, which are in also this society, we have overlapping generation of individuals, we have brood care, and we have reproductive division of labor. So these are the three key features that are all interconnected. So if we consider, for example, brood care, that means that the brood is unable to feed or even to move by themselves. So they have to be cared for by adults in the colony. And this, of course, requires the fact that there are overlapping generation of immatures and adults within the same colony. And finally, the reproductive division of labor is very important because this is one of the key features of eusociality, because in eusocial colony, we have a very, very strict division of tasks in terms of reproductive function. So we have one or few individuals that are fully committed to reproduction, to producing eggs, in the case of queens, of course, or sperm in the case of males. But all the other members of the colony, the worker caste in particular, they don't engage in any reproductive activities. They mainly engage in other colony tasks like foraging or nurses. So these are the three main definitions that we use to characterize eusociality.
So that seems like a really clear definition to me. But Jack and I were discussing earlier about how certain academics now feel that terminology such as eusocial is now outdated and no longer informative. So why do you think this is, and what is your personal thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, this is a very good point, Leanna, because there has been a sort of controversy in the recent years about the use of terms like eusociality, and in particular, all like a different type of attributes that are sometimes combined with eusociality. I don't know, probably you have heard about insects that are primitively eusocial or advanced eusocial. So this has been, I think the controversy derives from the fact that first we have to understand that there are actually different nuances and it's a sort of continuum. So it's difficult to set boundaries from what is primitive and what is advanced. And also it's often seen as a sort of anthropocentric vision, because sometimes we define primitively those society that looks more different from our society, human society, or the society of more like higher organism like vertebrates. But in the past, for example, primitively eusocial has been used for insects like bumblebees, for example, or some wasps that have annual cycles. So the colony dies at the end of the summer. Only reproductive individuals survive. And so these reproductive individuals, the following spring, they have to start a new colony. So they have to engage in all activities, not just reproduction, but also foraging, caring for the brood. And therefore, the reproductive division of labor is not that strict, so there is a high flexibility. So this is why they are considered primitively eusocial, while advanced eusocial is mainly ants or honeybees, where the queen doesn't do any foraging. She's not able to feed herself. So this is the distinction that has been normally used, but nowadays, yeah, people are a bit, like social biologists are a bit reluctant to use these categories for the reason I've stated.
Thank you for clearing that up for us, Fabio. I mean, personally, I feel that the term eusocial is still somewhat informative to a degree, but I can appreciate other people's viewpoints regarding the matter. But now, like some other insects, fire ants form colonies that are controlled by a single queen. And I was wondering if you could tell us, are these colonies founded by a single queen, or can cooperative founding occur between different unrelated queens?
This is a good question, Jack. Not so simple to address, because this is actually what I've been working on for the past few years. Because the founding behavior in fire ants is a very complex and plastic behavior. This is why we are interested in trying to understand what are the molecular basis for this behavior. And to try to make it simple so that I don't keep you here for hours, there are two main modalities of, so there are two social forms for colonies in fire ants of the species I'm working with, Solenopsis invicta. And these are colonies with multiple queens, which are called polygenic, and colonies with a single queen that are called monogenic. So in polygenic colonies, new colonies are formed simply by budding. So when queens are mature, new queens are mature, they simply leave the colony. They don't disperse very far, and they normally bring with them some workers, and they start a new colony in the area surrounding the mother colony. And therefore, all colonies are somehow connected. Maybe you have heard about the idea of super colonies sometimes, where there are links between mother and daughter colonies. So this is one modality. The other modality, monogyne colonies, where we have only one functional queen in a mature colony, are actually founded by dispersal. So queens like mate in the sky, they fly, they engage in mating flights, and then they disperse pretty far from the mother colony. And after mating flights, they can start a completely new colony, either by themselves alone or in groups of 2 or more queens, up to 30 queens in the field. It has been observed. But this is just a temporary phase, because in this incipient colony where you have multiple queens, the initial cooperation very quickly transition to conflict and open aggression. At the end of the first month, more or less, all queens but one are, they either are killed or they flee from the colony because they are attacked by the queens or by the workers. So in the end, only one queen will survive, even in those cases, because the final goal is to have only one queen in the functional colony. Yes. I hope I didn't make it too complicated.
No, that makes complete sense. Yeah. No. Also, in addition to the study of social behavior, your research also involves the principles of evolutionary ecology and functional genomics. So what exactly does this involve, and how does it relate to your work on the uncomplicated stuff regarding fire ants?
Yeah, so I really like the evolutionary ecology term because I think that's the best way to define what I do, what I like. Because I'm often asked, so what's your field? What's your expertise? How do you describe yourself? And it's often difficult because there could be many attributes that are suitable for what I do. But I think evolutionary ecology works well because I am an evolutionary biologist. I was trained during my PhD as an evolutionary biologist. So I immediately started getting used to ask the big question, why this happens, why do we have this feature, why this is the case. So this is the evolutionary component. But then I was also interested in the more functional components. So this kind of how questions, how these organisms interact with other organisms, how they interact in this environment. So combining the two, for me, it's the ideal strategy to address question of how organisms live in the environment where we find them and how they interact with the other components of the environment. The idea of the functional ecology came later during my first postdoc, and this is even a further more functional approach where I'm interested in understanding the subcellular components of how organism works in their environment. And so I started to get interested in genes in particular, and how genes regulate behavior or complex phenotypes. And again, this is a functional approach because I'm not simply interested in looking at the structure of genes or the structure of the genome, but to see how these components work and function to produce the phenotypes that we observe.
Well, I think you've demonstrated for us just how interconnected and complex the study of biology can be. And I know your research has also investigated how certain fire ant behaviours, such as colony foundation, for example, can be regulated by the ant's genetic components. So I was wondering, have any genes been identified so far that help explain these specific fire ant behaviours?
Yeah, I wish I could say yes. And I wish I had like a list of genes that have been demonstrated to be involved in the behavior of interest. But you're probably aware that this is a very long process. So most of the studies I've done are for now correlative studies. So we have been able to link some genes to the behavior of interest. I've attempted to go beyond that, so doing some more causative studies where we try to manipulate specific genes to see whether we have a modification in the behavior, but these haven't worked so far, so I will have to continue on this path. But for my study, if I had to pick some genes, for example, one key gene could be a gene called SLIT, which is was the one gene that basically we found differentially expressed between single founding queens and group founding queens very early in the process. So out of about 15,000 genes that are in the genome of ants, fire ants, only this one gene was differentially expressed. So we think it's very, very important in possibly regulating this behavior. And interestingly, this gene is known to regulate neural development, in particular the formation of dendrites and axons in the neural cells in Drosophila. So we know that this gene has this important function in Drosophila. We don't know whether the same functions are conserved in fire ants, but it could be a possibility. So that makes it very fascinating. But also in the studies I've done so far, there are some recurrent group of genes that show up as differentially regulated. Some of them are related to aging, for example. And I think one group of genes, I really like the name, they're called Methuselah, because they are normally associated with long life. So I think this could be a very cool candidate for regulating this behavior. And it could be possibly that the different type of colony founding is associated with different lifespan. And also stress genes are, stress-related genes are often involved. So maybe being in a group or being isolated is associated with different forms of stress for the ants.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, no, so that I just wanted to say that there are other genes instead from other studies that have been linked to fire ant social behavior, like the type of social forms for the two colony that I was describing earlier. So a series of studies have linked a specific super gene, which is a genomic region composed of multiple genes, which is called GP9. And this is associated with like odorant binding proteins, and they are consistently linked to the different social forms. So one GP9 variant is associated with monogeny, and the other GP9 variant with polygeny. So the polygyny. So this is basically, for now, the most striking evidence of a link between genetics and behavior.
No, it's amazing how a singular gene can be, you know, so important for so many key functions.
But you're totally right. So the difficulties on this type of approach in studies is trying to identify key genes and individual players, because we need to know who they are. But also, it's like we always have to keep in mind that genes are all interconnected. So it's in most of the cases, in particular for very complex behavior, it's very unlikely that a single gene is involved or is responsible for a behavior. There might be many of them. Yeah. But of course, for functional studies, we need to start from key candidates, try to test those and see where we go.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more quick question. So, Fabio, in your opinion, what does the future hold for the study of fire ant behaviors, and what may you ultimately learn from carrying out such research?
So, I might be biased, but in my personal opinion, of course, because I'm interested in social behavior and colony founding, I think there is a full possibility to explore the regulation of this behavior further and link it to other form of social behavior, not only in ants or insects, but even in vertebrates or even humans, because we know that some behaviors like cooperation or aggression are pretty conserved. And it's possible that similar genes are regulating these behaviors in different types of animals. So understanding how they are regulated in fire ants could link to possibly finding some clue about how these genes work in other organisms, and possibly finding some approach for patterns or like situation where social behavior is disrupted. For example, there is like a high interest in trying to understand how autism is regulated and what if there is a genetic component for autism. And there are some research that have started to address this from the point of view of honeybees, trying to look at honeybees and what genes are associated with disruption of social behavior in honeybees. So fire ants could also contribute to this pattern. But at another level, I can also mention, for example, that ants, fire ants, and many other like social insects are useful for study complex social interaction. So with like a very modern system of monitoring, automated monitoring of interaction, like trophallaxis or antennation or any other type of exchange, we can actually use ants as a tool to develop new approaches to study how humans, for example, interact with each other.
Well, I really, really enjoyed all of that, but sadly that's all we have time for today. But I would just like to give Fabio a massive thank you for joining us today. And if you would like to learn more about his research, then you can access his University of Aberdeen profile via the link below. Thank you all for tuning in today, and we hope you have a fantastic Northeast National Insight Week. We'll see you all next time, but bye for now.
Bye-bye.